Post-apocalyptic games are everywhere, but mid-apocalyptic games are a bit less common. It's here that Disaster Report 4 attempts to carve out a niche for itself. By focusing on the choices you make during a major disaster, it certainly stands out from other apocalyptic games. Unfortunately, while Disaster Report 4 is certainly unique, it just isn't very much fun to play. When you start the game, you're taken through a rather simplistic character creation where you get to change your character's gender and appearance. Now make no mistake, this is no Skyrim. Your customization options are limited to a few preset faces for each gender, as well as a few preset hairstyles. That's not to say it's bad necessarily, the character presets all look decent enough, but it's certainly more limited than many other offerings out there. After defining your character's physical appearance, you're given a few questions to define your character's personality. These questions are bizarre, to say the least. The questions will be things like, where are you from? And the responses often seem rather arbitrary. One answer might be, I'm from a town far from here, while another option will say, I'm from nowhere close to here, leaving the player sitting there struggling to see the difference between the two. These choices also seem to have no real bearing on the gameplay itself, making them almost entirely for personal roleplay, which is fine I suppose, but doesn't change the fact that they really feel strange and out of place. After the brief character creation, you're thrown into the gameplay where a massive earthquake strikes you while you're arriving in a new city. After a quick cutscene where you're once again presented with a strange, arbitrary dialogue choice, the gameplay begins, with you wandering the damaged streets of the city. Not the whole city, mind you, the game is broken up into several stages, each of which comprises a few blocks of the city at a time. In each stage you'll wander the area, trying to figure out how to progress. At first, the game has a strange sort of charm to it. The crux of the gameplay comes down to helping strangers to survive and making choices through dialogue. The whole thing has a bizarre B-movie vibe to it, and it's at first actually kind of endearing. For example, the early part of the game tasks you with getting water for an injured man in a convenience store. For some reason, neither of you thinks just to grab some off the shelf. Instead, you have to dress up as an employee of the convenience store and serve the angry customers because the cashier is cowering in the back. Then you take the toilet paper to the store manager, who is stuck in the bathroom with nary a roll in sight. Only then can you go and buy the water off the manager for an exorbitant price to give it to the injured man. Oh, and at some point, the real store manager comes in and runs off the man you've been talking to, who isn't actually the manager at all. This bizarre series of events is played totally straight. There isn't 1 second of tongue-in-cheek delivery or irony to any of it. Then there's the dialogue choices that appear every so often. These pop up during interactions with characters, and just like the choices at character creation, are often strangely arbitrary and ill-defined. It's not uncommon to be presented with a choice along the lines of agreed to help, excitedly agreed to help, sigh and agreed to help, and so on. One particularly interesting option came at a point where I had to shimmy across a ledge. The game presented me with a couple of options for how I wanted to go about this, such as go across the ledge, or instead I could choose to carefully go across the ledge. I had to cross this ledge multiple times throughout the level, and needless to say, there was absolutely no discernible difference between either choice in actual gameplay. It all exists to solely serve your own personal roleplay, that in a system of moral points that supposedly tracks your morality throughout the game. Different choices can earn you points, moral points for good choices, and immoral points for bad choices. But once again, the system seems to have no actual effect on the gameplay, beyond simply giving you a visual reminder of whether you are playing a good person or a bad person. Otherwise, it didn't noticeably change anything about the experience. For the first few hours, the sheer strangeness and earnestness of the whole experience are actually pretty charming, in the same way that a lot of B-movies can be. It's not really all that good, and at times you're baffled by why something is the way it is, and yet you keep going, spurred on by a strange fascination with the whole thing. I found myself weirdly invested in the journey early on, putting a lot of time into my strange and arbitrary choices. Unfortunately, time ultimately betrays Disaster Report 4. After playing for a few hours, the novelty of the experience begins to wear off, and once that charm is gone, you realize the game has very, very little to keep you going. The majority of the actual gameplay boils down to either extremely simplistic puzzle solving or dull and repetitive fetch quests. The arbitrary nature of the dialogue choices carries over into the actual gameplay, with very specific and often frustratingly obtuse solutions that require you to talk to every NPC or react with every single object on the off chance that for some undefined and unknowable reason they might have what you need to progress. Once the game's strange charm wears off, you're left with a game that's best described as tedious. The game quickly begins to feel like a chore. One particular mission required me to backtrack through an apartment complex 3 different times. I would collect an object, return to the guy who told me about it, only to be told of yet another object that I needed to get, all the way on the other side of the complex. That's not gameplay, that's busy work. Disaster Report 4 is at times a charming game. It has an earnestness reminiscent of So Bad They're Good B-movies, and for the first few hours, it carries the game forward. Unfortunately, Disaster Report 4 also lasts considerably longer than a B-movie, giving it plenty of time for the quirky appeal to give way to tedium, frustration, and boredom. I suppose some people could find some enjoyment to squeeze out of its roleplay, simultaneously strangely specific and abstract. But for most of us, the game will wear thin after only a few hours. There's a certain earnestness to Disaster Report 4 that can be charming, but that charm only goes so far, and the game's dull mechanics and poor design overstay their welcome. And that wraps it up. If you like what we are doing, please consider subscribing to our channel, and don't forget to switch on the bell notification icon. That way you will never miss out on any of our videos.